Cool. So aims of today's session, as usual, I'm not promising to get through all of these. And as usual, the usual caveat that this is my work based on my research and, my experiences and the stuff that I do. So I'm sure other people that have different views to share or different experiences to share, and we're really open to hearing that. Hopefully we'll have time at the end. But basically today in our whistle stop tour, we want to do a bit of shared learning on why we need to analyse land as foundational to the housing crisis that we're facing in the UK. Develop a bit of understanding on why, as housing activists, we need to be scrutinising land and planning reforms, and a little bit of touching on strengthening our message around land politics and policies. And I've got some ideas from some stuff, some work I've done with NEF, at NEF with my colleague Emmett and others. So I think I just wanted to start off by really talking about the fact that, of course, land became treated as a tradable good around the 16th century during the birth of the enclosure movement, which I'm sure many have heard of. If you haven't, I'm happy to send out some reading and stuff on this. The enclosure movement gained significant traction during the 18th century and became legislated from 1836, where private land really became legislated in this country. And from this moment, land became a tool or a mechanism, a space in which wealth and power was quite significantly hoarded by some at the expense of others. Of course, during the enclosure movement, we saw communities, whole towns, villages, places which are now cities actually forcibly removed, had their land forcibly removed from them, and it became fenced off and privatised. And I think particularly at this current juncture, the paradoxical nature of land as both the source of power and the source of displacement is no less clearer today than it was centuries ago. And we see this both in the UK and internationally. I think often we tend to focus our attention on what sits on the land, particularly for people in this room. We focus on housing to try and make sense of what's going on. And that's not uncommon. But I think what I really want us to do today is think about land as integral to absolutely everything we do and our everyday lives. And that's from what it's worth, who has the right to be on it, who owns it. They all determine how we live our lives. And I'm not going to have space today to talk about how we kind of trace ownership and what we do with that information. But if there's appetite and people want to do some sessions on that, then I'd be very keen. So do let us know. We're focused so much on the reactive, I think, in the housing movement. I talk about this quite a lot. A lot of us focus on eviction resistances and rent rises, that the concentration of land ownership in this country has often slipped under our radar. And I don't say this just for activists. This is really common in urban studies and in housing scholarship. Often the land question has been really, really detached from the housing question. So as I said, really today is about getting kind of our baseline as to why the housing crisis is a land crisis and why at this particular moment we need to be talking about land as the asset that we need to be pushing back on. Next slide, please. Okay, so the UK has a dysfunctional land market. I think that's not news to anyone, which contributes in large part to the housing issues and wealth inequalities that we see today. The economic model that underpins our development of places and homes, I would argue, is fundamentally broken. It's, as I said, based on wealth hoarding and serves as a mechanism with which to extract private profit from assets that were previously and should have remained in public goods. So often when we talk about that, we talk about houses that we lost through the right to buy. But I really want to focus today on how much of the land that we've lost to privatisation. And this model, this extractive development model that we have in this country has seen an increase in both rents and house prices that, of course, has left 8.5 million people with some form of unmet housing needs. I think one of the stats that often people don't kind of talk about when we talk about the increase in house prices and in rents is that approximately 80% of the rise in house prices, so the purchase price of a house, is actually due to land value increases. It's not actually anything to do with the house itself as an asset. It's not the bricks and the mortar or the construction that's necessarily got more expensive and seen this exponential rise. It's a consistent process of land speculation and gentrification, which we'll come on to. The value of someone's house isn't what is what's pushing up that price. So often that's why we see so many vast swathes of housing and other buildings demolished and rebuilt, or developers buying up kind of old streets that have previously sat empty, because it's the value of the land that's really important. Next slide, please. So yeah, if we go to the next slide, I think I've totally shifted my slides about. So the back one, please, Domi. Sorry, that was me. The value of land in this country has risen by over 600% since 1995, which is an astronomical figure when you think about the fact that we're talking about land that hasn't changed its use. You know, this could be land that has sat vacant since 95 to now. In that period, house prices have increased 300%. And this is kind of the most eye-watering stat, and one that if anyone came to the NIMBY YIMBY session that we did the other week, or anyone's been following the planning permission or the bulldozing of the planning laws that Starmer et al. Are talking about, the fact that planning permission, when it's awarded, so if someone has a piece of land and they get planning permission to build residential property on it or any form of property on it, that value of that land overnight increases more than 275 times. And that's 275 times more than agricultural land as well, meaning developers are willing to pursue any means to secure their projects. And we'll get onto that a bit. So I think what I really want us to be doing is to be connecting why, in response to the chronic housing crisis that we have, we're seeing the government now and governments previously really focus on land reform, and the fact that there is so much private capital to be made from land. And that's a really important part of the housing story. So often the question that I'm faced with when I talk about these things is, if land is so finite and we have a housing shortage, why are our towns and cities littered with empty sites? And this is really the start. Whenever I talk about the land as the foundation to the housing crisis is where I start, because we have a speculative property market in this country that is absolutely rife. So a lot of people may have heard talk of speculation or private land banking. And what that means is that anyone who has capital, not always wealthy individuals, to be fair, if you're living in cities like Liverpool, our land values are really quite low relative to others. But anyone with capital buys up sites and then sits on them, and it's the sitting on them, leaving them empty or in their current state, which is what the speculation part of this means. And they sit on that until the value of it rises. And as I said, land banking has been active for years, and it's particularly prominent in poorer areas. And what local authorities, governments, commentators in this space never want us to acknowledge is that the reason why people sit on this land and they keep it empty is because any investment that goes on around that land, be that public investment, so that's taxpayers' money, or community investment, whatever we build, it adds wealth to those private landowners' pockets. So, for example, if you have a piece of empty land and, you know, the government invests money into a train track being built there, or if, you know, we crowdfund and get a community centre there, or if a GP surgery is placed near it, it increases the value of the land, and that private owner profits as and when they choose to move on that land. And the really big point here, and the reason why our development system is so broken, is that we, as the public, the community, have absolutely no way of accruing that wealth back in terms of policy as to where it is now, right? So that public good that we put into that, be that capital, as in financial capital or social capital or any other forms of capital, private landowners that bank land, that speculate on it in spaces, are able to gain value from that, because the value of their land increases, because you're more likely to get planning permission on a land where there's a GP surgery and a train track and community spaces. And we never, ever gain that profit back. And that's, you know, the fundamental problem with the development system that we have in this country. Okay, so often the next question that I get asked is, why wouldn't local authorities hold this land? Well, of course they used to, and I'm sure this isn't news to a lot of people, but do bear with me, because as I've said in a few of these sessions, we really want these sessions to be kind of for everyone, whether they're at the start of their journey in the housing movement or well-versed in it. So few stats, since 1979, so since Thatcher did what she did in terms of privatisation, the local authorities in Britain have lost 2 million hectares of land that they previously owned. So 2 million hectares, which is approximately 10% of the whole of Britain, was previously held in public ownership and has been lost since privatisation came in. So the amount of privatised land over the last 40 years is worth now at least, and this is a conservative with a small c estimate, £420 billion. So for comparison, no other form of privatisation, is worth even a tenth of that today. But land privatisation is often not the one that we talk about, right? We we rightly talk about the privatization of healthcare, privatization of housing. We talk about the privatization of schools through academy systems, of our transport. But at the bottom of that, the foundation of that is the land that's been privatized on, and that's often not part of the discussion. And it's a real blocker for us in building our arguments. And of course, it's, you know, without surprise that local authorities are not adequately resourced to play a role in their local land markets, right? We will have all seen this. We know that local authorities constantly are at the behest of private speculators who own that land, whether that's through having to kind of beg, borrow, and steal off them to build on that land, or whether that's because the people that own the private land won't allow certain things to be built. So for example, when HS2 was in its, you know, is it going to be built, is it not going to be built stages, the government spent millions, if not billions of pounds, buying land that was empty off private landowners who had speculated on it for years, because the government needed that land to build what was going to be HS2, theoretically going to be a public service, although perhaps that's an argument for another day. And the government had to pay over the odds for that land because that land had value to us as a public, but the local authority had, in many cases, sold it off. So, of course, local authorities own less land than ever before. We've seen this through housing grant cuts, decimation of housing stock, you know, in places. I know I always use Liverpool as an example, but it's true. We only have 141 council homes in our city. It's quite incredible that we have so few relative to other places that also don't have enough, but, you know, Manchester 25,000, Bristol around 18,000. So of course, local authorities that own absolutely no council stock, and any local authority that even owns a small amount, therefore have sold off their rights to that land when they got rid of that housing. And I just wanted to go a bit more into this. Next slide, please, Domi. So I'm sure a lot of you know of Locality, which is an organization that do fantastic research. And they did a paper, I think it first came out in 2018, and it's updated in 2022, called The Great British Sell-Off. Notice I didn't capitalize the G in great, that was deliberate. I think the big question they ask, and those of us that work in this space kind of in their kind of scholarship around land and housing is, as I said, why it's not widely discussed, why all of the stats that I've just given you about how much money we've lost hasn't been discussed. And I think a big part of that is what you would call, like, you know, death by 1,000 cuts. As I've just said, like, land is integral to every local authority department. So what happened was it became really difficult to track where it was being sold off, because it was being chipped away in every single department. So we're talking like forestry departments, NHS, housing, town halls, government offices, community centres, schools. It became really difficult to track because what we saw was quite like a normalisation of this. The first thing to be sold off under austerity was our land, right? And so it became, in many senses, like it was just normal to not have that land and to rely on outsourcing or renting from private organisations. So a few stats here. So Locality found that on average, still every year, 4,131 buildings or spaces have been sold off that were previously in local authority ownership. And that's still happening today, which is quite astounding considering the fact that, I don't know about your local authorities, but mine has very few things left in its public ownership. The fact that this is still going on showed us how much we had in local authority in the public sector and how little we have now. The equivalent that Locality lists for this is that figure, 4,131, is more than 4 times the amount of Starbucks across the UK. And that's, so more than 4 times the amount of Starbucks we have across the UK is being sold off each year by our local authorities. And I'd just like to add as well, and maybe we can get onto this in a different session, but when we say sold off, there's a lot of let's call them deals that go on that mean that local authorities do not accrue the value of the land in the way that private landowners can, right? So what you'll see is, you know, I've spoken to people that I know that are on this call and others that aren't here around research that I did my PhD, which was around land being given away for £1 because local authorities just can't hold on to it because they have no money to put into it, so they just want to get rid of it because they're also told from top down that they need to be getting rid of it, right? So this is a huge problem. I think to say, just to go back one more slide, just a few more things is around like as I said, it's impossible to say with any certainty, no matter how good you are at economic modelling, just how many individual pieces of land have been sold off in total, because simultaneous to the funding cuts that meant that we were selling off all of our crown jewels, as it was called at the time, there were funding cuts that meant that record keeping absolutely plummeted in local authorities. So there just wasn't the data kept on this. So this is a huge problem, and also something, and I know a lot of these things often when we're in the housing movement seem like things that we shouldn't be spending the time pushing on, like kind of like administrative record keeping in local authorities, but it's so important. Like if we don't know what land we sold, or we don't know what land we have, we don't know where we can make demands, we don't know where we can talk about where things should be built and where things should be. That said, one certainty that a colleague did some research on is that we know that there's been over 10,000 sales of local authority owned school playing fields alone in the last decade. So over 10,000 schools have lost their playing fields. Obviously, we know the ramifications for that kind of in terms of kids' development and stuff. And obviously land continues to provide many basic social and environmental infrastructures. So things like, as we said, affordable housing, allotments, libraries, leisure centres, parks, these are now all being outsourced because we lost the control of that land. And it becomes this perpetual cycle where we're now going to continually pay for that, for, well, I don't want to, be doomy, but for as long as I can see. Next slide, please, Domi. Okay, so how is this model maintained? So there's a few key policies that allow for this model. And I really, really don't have time to go into all this, but happy to, as I said, do another session, or if people want to chat about this, get in touch. But the first big reason is this concept called hope value, which some people may be well versed with, some people may not. So hope value is the increased financial value created by the development of a place or land that's privately captured by landowners. And they're able to lean on this concept of quote unquote hope value to capitalize on that asset. Now, what this means in total plain English terms is the difference between the actual value of the land, so the price at which it was purchased, and the relative to the possible value if it was to be used for different purposes. Now, going back to the first slide where I said that if you get planning permission on a piece of land, it increases by 275 times that amount. That's where this difference comes in, right? So, for example, a farmer might have a piece of land that is worth, at its use value right now, £10,000, say. They probably bought it for £2,000, but let's say £10,000. Theoretically, if that farmer got planning permission on that land, which of course we know the current government are really ramping up, pushing through planning permission on all types of land, brownfield, greyfield and greenfield. So theoretically, with planning permission, that farmer could say that their land is worth £200,000. So if a local authority wanted to buy that land to build council housing, for example, the farmer could make the case for the fact that that empty site of land could be worth £200,000, not the £10,000 it's actually worth. And the local authority would then have to pay that much. I hope I'm making sense and people are following. This is also to add the fact that even if a local authority, let's say, paid that increase of £190,000, so that hope value, so that £190,000 is that hope value, even if they paid that, it's likely that if they were wanting to use that land to, for example, build council housing, that land would require remediation work. So it would require, like, they would have to do stuff to the land to make it viable for housing to be built on it. Now, most commonly, remediation work is discussed on pieces of land that have previously had factories on it, or there's been manufacturing of certain resources that then lays dormant in the land, and that needs to be remediated and work done to it to ensure that it's not toxic if you were to build housing on it. But regardless of the type of land, whether it's kind of greenfield land or brownfield land, brownfield being the manufacturing type land, remediation work will still need to be done. So the local authority will still then have to fit the bill to do work on the land before it even gets close to building the houses. And obviously we know famously that local authorities have no money to even build houses, let alone buy land. And this is why we end up with a system, which is the one I was referencing, which is where we're begging and borrowing for private developers who own the land and saying, please, please, please build affordable housing for us. Like, please, please, please give us 20% of this. And of course, we know they don't do this. And when you lay it out like this and you look at how much power they have in the land that they hold, why would they do this, right? they know that land is finite and that they hold all the power in that space. So, of course, one of our key demands, and I know this has been key for other people in the movement and work we've done at NEF, is the removal of hope value. And I'll kind of briefly talk about what, at the end, what recently Labour have announced. But just to make you all, I guess, angry, because I think it's important to be angry, in 2016-17 alone, landowners in England made £13.4 billion in windfall profits. Windfall profits are sudden and unexpected spikes in earnings. And that was because planning permission was granted on their lands to attend to the chronic housing crisis. There was only an estimated 4 billion of that value, that was recaptured by the public through the mechanisms that have been introduced that we're always told are fantastic and mean that we can get affordable housing. So generally that's through section 106 contributions, right? So the amount of housing that has to be built, affordable housing that has to be built, or what the developer has to give back to the community. And of course we know that so many of those affordable houses aren't built. We know that for a fact. That's not just me riffing off distaste for developers. So these developers have gained, what, 13.4 billion in 1 year alone on land that is effectively been brought up in price because public goods were going to be created around that land. So particularly the need for housing, but other investment, right? Because when a housing development is built, and this is not me defending the government, but theoretically, according to local plans and planning laws, if housing developments are built, there has to be other investment around the space, right? So they are benefiting from other investment that's being put in that space. And our question is, of course, why should landowners be able to profit from this? Not least considering how cheaply often the land was bought for. Next slide, please, Domi. Okay, so bringing this back to housing. So since 2007 alone, 1.4 million houses have had planning permission. So the value of that land has gone up 275 times, or 45 times, can't even remember what I said. And those houses have not been built, right? And the reason is because gaining that planning permission is enough for the developer to be able to value their land at a certain level. And often that's to do with leveraging assets in their business. And of course, we know that no local authorities have been able to build council homes. And the government has consistently failed to impose any requirement on developers that actually builds houses, regardless of affordability or not. You know, we see a lot of houses being built, luxury houses that are very, very clearly just for kind of Airbnb and short-term lets. But the consistent failure of the government to ever require developers to build what they want is very clear to us. And I think once you track back through the changes in land and the changes in land use, you can kind of see how that's happened and where that control lies. Next slide, please, Domi. Okay, so again, this is kind of like similar arguments, but just wanted to really lay it out for everyone. A lot of people say, well, why can't local authorities resist this process? Why can't we take developers to court? Why can't we hold them to account? As I say in every one of these sessions, there's been over 50% of cuts in planning departments, much more in other places. But the really big reason is that any challenges to planning applications, we've been talking about this for years, but you really see it now when you listen to Starmer and Rayner talk about blockers, not builders, and all of this. Basically, what happens is if a local authority challenges a planning application, it can result in a costly and lengthy legal battle, or at least the threat of it. And I see this and have seen this a lot in my work and kind of in day to day, and I'm sure a lot of us have. And of course, these legal battles are totally unaffordable to local authorities who exist within what we would call a fiscal straitjacket of austerity. I think it's also worth saying that when austerity measures hit planning departments, a lot of the planners fled the public sector for obvious reasons and moved to the private sector. And a lot of developers are now benefiting from the fact that they have previous public planners working for their organizations. They know their way around the systems. They know how to write a planning application that gets through. They know how to ensure that if a planning application is rejected, for example, a lengthy legal battle would come in. And then the other side of this is, of course, as we know, and to be fair, this is going to get a lot worse, our planning system is defined by weak consultation process that sees the discretion of decision makers take precedence, irrespective of the needs of communities outlined in local plans or in community consultations. Next slide, please, Domi. trying to figure out where I'm at with my slides. Okay. Okay, so why is this? Why are we bringing this up now? Why is this important for the housing movement? We really do need to start focusing on land ownership, because of course, without the land, the houses can always be taken away from us. You know, you only have to look at kind of any study of regeneration and gentrification to see that even council housing gets demolished on a whim. What little we have left, affordable housing, you know, very quickly gets taken away. And I think for me, and you know, this is kind of my personal and political position, but keeping on fighting for the sorts of kind of tiny crumbs that we are, or it feels like we are, is almost feels like a bit of a moot point if we're not focusing on the land and how we can at least hold landowners to account more, because yeah, we know that they can just carve us out. Of course, and I'm not going to go into this now, but there are great examples of community-led alternatives like CLTs, which stands for Community Land Trusts, that have for decades explored this as to different levels of success. Some great examples in the States, some great examples in the UK. I'm not advocating for this model. I'm saying it's something for us to think about. And it is an example where that movement saw the fact that without holding on to that land, I can never pronounce that word, in perpetuity. Probably should be able to pronounce that word considering I talk about land all the time. Without being able to hold land forever, effectively, then we aren't going to have safety in our housing. We're not going to have safety in our housing movement. You know, and perhaps that's quite a doomy look. Of course, if we have mass council housing, then it would be different because developers wouldn't have as much of a stronghold over us. We wouldn't be relying on them for giving us crumbs on their developments. But it is a really important thing for, I think, us to think about, particularly at this moment. Next slide, please, Domi. Okay, what do we need instead? I've totally messed up my slides here. Okay, so key message, if we haven't already got it, is that land is vital because we really can't make more of it. And we will really, I've said here, we can't get it back. We will really struggle to pull it back. So hanging on to what little we have left is really important. That's why it's important, in my opinion, to kind of, even though they often feel like rigged processes, if you get invited to community consultations on local authority land sell-offs or on what's going on developments, please try your best to try and engage. I know they're draconian. I know, as I said, they often feel rigged, but it is important. It's particularly important now because the recent planning and infrastructure bill means that we're going to have less oversight from local democratic voices, because that's what the government wants. So we need to be kicking up as much as fast as we can. Of course, we need a planning system that redistributes power over land and housing from private developers and landowners to local government. And we need a government that prioritizes public good. Still very blue sky thinking from me, which is not me at all. So quickly, if we go on to the next slide, I'm conscious of time, we've got time, okay. So just some examples of policy stuff that we've come out with from NEF that could kind of overnight have an impact on this. So the first one is around stronger land readjustment powers for local government. So what we mean by this is, and this has come in, Matthew Pennycook's just announced this recently, but it's not as wholesale as we want it to be. But what we want is for public bodies, local authorities, for example, to be able to acquire land at use value. So going back to the example I used, at that £10,000 as opposed to the £200,000 with the hope value, and then redistribute ownership within sites if that's necessary, to engage with communities. And doing that at use value obviously saves money for the local authority and means that necessary infrastructure and subsequent development of social housing can be achieved, right? Because they're not hemorrhaging 190 grand, for example, unnecessarily. And also because why should, there's an ideological argument around that. Why should a landowner be able to get, a 25-fold profit on a piece of land that sits empty in the middle of a housing crisis, right? Of course, more substantial public ownership of land and housing over the long term would be a long-term goal, to recapture any value uplift. Community asset transfer policies is something that I don't think we'll have time to talk about, but is one mechanism that some local authorities have been using. And I'd be really keen to hear if anyone's had experience of this. This is where instead of a local authority selling off their land or giving away their land to a private developer, because local authorities are still in the space of saying that they cannot hold on to lands because they don't have any money. What has been lobbied for a long time is people saying, okay, well, if you can't hold on to that land as a public body, you should transfer that asset to a community group. And there are many examples of that, whether it's a community housing group, it could be community sports teams, it could be anything. It could be for community hubs, youth centres, whatever. Now, these policies sound great. I've been in the trenches with some of them, trying to support community groups go through them. They're not that easy, but nor is any legislation to get through. But it's not the end goal for us. But if it's a meanwhile fix to stop local authorities hemorrhaging more of their land at the moment, then it's certainly something that we should be making people aware of and making use of as and where we can. Because there's nothing to say that, if the asset gets transferred to the community and then a few years in, the community doesn't want to hold on to that asset anymore or is struggling to hold on to it, that could be transferred back to a local authority, although that line of argument worked better when the Labour government hadn't announced austerity 2.0. So, that one's a work in progress. I think a really big point is forcing developers to act on land within a specified time frame. That stat that I said, around 1.4 million homes not being built since 2007. Why the hell should developers be allowed to just do that? We all have to do things within a certain time frame. We all have deadlines. They should too. The only reason they're not building those houses and land lays vacant is because they're speculating on it and waiting for it to be more profitable. The government shouldn't be allowing that. We should be really pushing for certain timeframes in which things are delivered. And if they're not delivered in that time frame because suspiciously a developer goes into liquidation, which happens a lot in the Northwest, then that land should go back into public ownership, right? That's how it should work. A big one that gets me shouted at a lot by people that aren't in the housing movement is that profit viability levels for developers should be moved down from 15 to 20%, which is what it's at now. So just for those of you that aren't well versed in that. So viability levels, you'll often hear developers say, oh, we couldn't build those affordable housing that we promised to build because it wasn't viable. And what they mean is that if they built 20% affordable housing, they wouldn't make 20% profit. And why should they be able to make 20% profit? 20% profit on a housing development is an eye-watering amount of profit, because we know how much profit there is to be made in that sector. So we really should be pushing for developer viability levels to come down from the 15 to 20% space, because that will immediately enable, I don't defend the concept of affordable housing because it's inaffordable, but it would free up space for different types of housing as opposed to private for-profit housing on developments. And then, of course, the inevitable one, which is restoring resourcing for local planning departments. And I want to be really clear on this from a perspective of NEF, and the work that I do here is it's not just adding 250 planners, I think was maybe the figure that Angela Rayner put out. It's about restoring our planning departments and other departments to pre-austerity funding levels, because at the end of the day, firstly, they were at those levels before austerity for a reason. We needed them, and everything's got a hell of a lot worse since austerity. So adding a tiny bit on top is not going to help us. It's not even a drop in the ocean. We really need to be pushing and advocating for pre-austerity funding levels, whether that's resourcing in staff, whether that's grant funding, whatever it is. And we also need that in the context of the current government really pushing for us to bulldoze the planning system, because planning applications need proper scrutiny. And developers naturally have the upper hand. They have very deep pockets, and they have lawyers that are well versed in this in a way that local authorities aren't. And I'm quite deeply fearful of the fact that planning applications are going to be pushed through very quickly, as the government have said, and they will not be properly scrutinised. We know that developers have a history of not building the types of homes we need, whether that's size, whether that's tenure, whether that's location. We also know that deregulation in planning and housing, which is what the government are advocating for, has caused tragedies like Grenfell. It's caused huge problems in terms of new builds falling apart. I'm sure we've all seen stories of that. So the resourcing and the funding at local authority level is also about them being able to scrutinise what is being built on our land and what is being built in our towns and cities, and that's really important.